Hey, so Kelly had a great idea of why don't we get together and cover the Q&A portion of this as a separate conversation. I think our original intention was to simply have kind of a written Q&A, and I think what would be interesting in a couple of different ways is the conversation, but truly make conversation. So what I did was I invited one of our subject matter experts to join me in this topic. Mr. Russell Singer is one of our solution architects with Arrow, and I thought that would be a fun way to just kind of banter a little bit back and forth about some of these questions. So unfortunately, we don't have the audience with us anymore, and so some of these questions might need a little bit of clarification, but I think between the two of us, we could probably interpret them, make some assumptions, and carry forward. So Russell, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Thanks for the introduction, too. I'm happy to be here. Happy to answer some of these questions with you.
Perfect. So one of the first questions we got, and I think I addressed it on the call, but it's a good idea to maybe even help validate and see if there's any color commentary. The question was, does Avaya support SAN certs across devices and servers, such as Communication Manager, Session Manager, the Application Enablement Server, etc.? And when we're talking about SAN, my assumption is we're talking about subject alternative name kind of things. One, would you agree with that assessment? Am I thinking something else like storage area networking? I don't think so, right?
No, that's right. Yeah, it's the subject alternative name. And usually the reason people want to do this is because they only want to manage one certificate across multiple devices, right? So you might have multiple host names for a single device in a certificate, or multiple host names for multiple devices in a single certificate.
A really great example of that is with internally within Arrow, our Avaya Aura conferencing server. When we first deployed it, we were Arrow S3, and so our conferencing name is arrows3.com. And obviously, since then, we've changed our name, our brand, our FQDNs. And one of the things that we're a little nervous about is, a lot of people have published that URL to people to join content type collaboration, and I wanted to make sure that no matter if they were using the arrows3.com versus the arrowsi.com, either way it would get there using one identity certificate working for multiple scenarios. So I think that's probably one of the valid reasons why you might do something like that.
Yeah, that's right. And also if you have multiple, so one example might be a global deployment of Session Manager or CM even, right? Or SPCs, and you wanted to have one certificate across all of those devices, you would just throw the host name and or IP address into your SAN list for that certificate for each SPC, each SM, and publish that as one certificate rather than having to manage a dozen or more certificates individually.
Sounds good. Thank you. So our second question, does Arrow have a training class on this subject of security certificates? And if not, will it be a future training class that we offer? And I happen to already know that no, Arrow Learning Services doesn't have this particular class yet. But I fed that into the leadership team of that organization, and I think we'll start working on it. I think for me, this session was kind of the first in that training to not only raise awareness and get people to understand the idea of security certificates, but then obviously the follow-up is, okay, for what purpose? And it's ultimately securing our systems and getting from SHA-1 to SHA-2 and all that kind of good stuff. So another question that came up, and this is one that might be, it's maybe more of a statement than a question, but OCSP is also used, Online Certificate Status Protocol, and that's a term I wasn't familiar with. Russell, could you tell us a little bit about that protocol and what it's used for?
Yeah, it's really just used as a standard for validating the format of a certificate. And so whenever you have a device or an endpoint that's trying to validate a certificate, it uses that protocol to validate the certificate. And it's not just validating, the timestamp or the expiry date. It's also validating the format, the fingerprint, the and the certificate chain as well.
Okay, good. Thank you. Um, Another question, what protocol specific to telephony requires certificates? Is it just HTTPS and TLS? And I think when we look at those, obviously the HTTPS we talked about during the webinar is, when you want, to go to a website, an actual legitimate website in a browser kind of a thing. And certainly that is using a certificate behind the scenes. We used to think of it as SSL. Now technically it's just an evolution of SSL into TLS. And then they were talking about TLS, and I think we probably have to clarify where is TLS actually used, right? And some of the obvious ones I think of are encrypted voice, encrypted signaling, and some of the newer versions of Communication Manager, we can even do TLS on the gateways now. Can you think of other uses and other scenarios where TLS would apply? I don't know if it's an easy list to come up with.
Yeah. And one thing that I think people get confused with is when they see TLS, they think of SIP in our world, right? Because we're unified or contact center, UC or CC. But actually TLS is the protocol that's used to encrypt even HTTP traffic, right? So TLS is really the encryption protocol, transport layer security. So that's kind of a more general term for the protocol. HTTPS, SSH, SCP, SIPs, SRTP, right? Those all implement some form of TLS to encrypt the traffic. This is an interesting question because typically when you think about encryption, you would want to encrypt any traffic that leaves your box, right, or is entering your box. So you have a CM or a session manager, you want to encrypt anything that comes in or goes out of that, right? But with all of the malware and other stuff that can potentially run even on a box, sometimes it's even smart to encrypt traffic within an application, between different components on a server or that are part of an application. And so most of the Avaya stuff even lets you do that, right? Encrypting traffic between different components of an application. And in fact, Session Manager is a good example of that. It encrypts traffic between the security module and the Session Manager management module, right? Those components of Session Manager.
Gotcha. And one of the other ones you mentioned, kind of went through some protocol acronym soup, right? Alphabet soup. But what you mentioned, no, it's totally good. You had me, but I was thinking the SSH is one where I think a lot of people use it. They don't even know they're using it. Like if for something like Avaya Site Administration, right? Let's say you're still using it as your management tool. Behind the scenes, if you want that traffic encrypted, and you do want that traffic encrypted, you are using SSH, and you're using it on port 5022. And behind the scenes, that is doing TLS.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it's the same for FTP and SFTP or SCP, secure copy, right? So yeah, that's all TLS, and all of that requires some form of a certificate, right, and a private key.
Another question, can a system manager certificate be signed so that it is more readily accepted? And the answer that I gave during the webinar was, obviously you have to define what readily accepted means, but I would, one of my first reactions was, well, if we made system manager an intermediate certificate authority of your existing enterprise certificate authority, that means your enterprise certificate authority is still the root, but they've given signing permission to system manager. I think the more readily accepted portion of that is, well, my guess is your IT department has already distributed this the root CA trust cert to all of the devices. So by them letting system manager be an intermediate signing authority, well, then all of a sudden, they kind of gets accepted by default. Would you agree with that answer? Would you think of any other scenarios where you might think of to make a signed certificate more readily accepted?
Well, no, and I think that, yeah, that's definitely the right answer. The big advantage for doing that with System Manager is now there are more and more things that leverage the enrollment, the auto enrollment that's associated with System Manager, right? So you attach a new session manager, it does an auto enroll to get the certificate, create a private key, and everything, right? All you do is put in the enrollment password, and so it makes it really easy to manage your certificate on a session manager or Breeze or some other component now, right? So if you have System Manager set up to be a sub-CA or an intermediate CA that's trusted by devices that will be registering to a session manager, for example, then you've really streamlined your entire enrollment process and your certificate distribution as well. So it makes things a little bit easier to manage if you are able to convince your IT security people that that is the right move. Whereas if you don't do that, then you have completely different CAs that are not even related to each other, for one thing, and it's more difficult to manage certificates manually on Session Manager and Breeze and those types of components.
So, and you mentioned a good thing, and I kind of went so far as to say, boy, I've yet to find a customer willing to, use System Manager as an intermediate. Yet you were telling me in your previous life, you found that to be the absolute best way to do it. So,
Yeah.
twofold question. One, do you find other customers willing to make System Manager an intermediate certificate authority? And is that your preferred method?
Well, the answer is yes, Dave, and part of the reason for that is because it's so to invalidate a sub or intermediate CA if you need to, right? Like, let's say for some reason that the System Manager private key was hacked and it got out there, right, and you needed to replace it. It's easy for an IT to do that. However, if for some reason your private key gets hacked for your root CA, then you pretty much have to start from scratch, right? So the recommendation, in fact, in practice and best practices in the industry for TLS in general is not to use the root CA to sign any certificates. You would always have an intermediate CA, whether that's the IT administered intermediate CA or an intermediate CA that they've allowed you to run on System Manager, right? That's the idea behind that is if it does get hacked and it's out there, it's easy to replace.
Gotcha. Well, that's good. And gives me hope that maybe more customers would be interested in doing that, because I certainly agree with the model of, I'd love to be able to use System Manager wherever I can as a signing authority, but at the same time, you want the ease of use of leveraging your enterprise as well. So to me,
Yeah.
it does sound like it gives you the best of both worlds. So another question is, can you explain wildcard certs and if Avaya supports them? When I think of a wildcard cert, right, I tend to think of literally a wildcard where I'm maybe taking an entire domain and using a single identity cert that can be put on multiple devices. Again, is that accurate? Is that what we're talking about? And is that a legitimate thing to do in a UC environment?
Yeah, I mean, that's an accurate assumption, definitely. A lot of customers are interested in wildcard certificates. You can do that in a UC environment. We've done it before for entire Scopia implementations, entire Aura implementations, at least with the Aura core. The trick there is you need to manually generate and install a private key, because whenever you create a certificate signing request, there's always a private key associated with that. And so you need to be able to use a single private key wherever you install that wildcard certificate. Other than that, yeah, it works fine. I mean, there's not anything that will validate that will follow the OCSP, that protocol to validate a certificate will accept a wildcard certificate.
Gotcha. Cool. Next question. Some Avaya devices, like Session Manager, seem to require strange things to be included in the CSR, right, the certificate signing request, such as IP address, which public CAs regard as taboo. Plus this, plus the subdomain syntax in the CSR, and I'm trying to scroll through these, it's a long question. This plus the subdomain name syntax in the CSR has made getting a public CA cert difficult from companies like Thought and others. Kind of,
Yeah.
are there any special hints to using this with the well-known or the public certificate authorities?
So there are definitely some of the more restrictive CAs, public CAs, won't let you put in an IP address as your common name. Or I'm not quite sure what the comment is actually about the subdomain name syntax. I don't. We never had any issue with that, but our subdomains weren't 60 characters long either, so I don't know what the deal is there. But definitely with IP addresses, a lot of public CAs discourage the use of an IP address as the common name, but some of the larger ones will let you do it, like Symantec and GoDaddy. So I guess it just depends, and maybe if you find one that doesn't, you can look for another one that does or that would let you. But I will say it's pretty rare that you need to use a public CA for Session Manager. Typically, if you're going to be doing any certificate signing on Session Manager, it's with an intermediate private CA. So, and those will always allow you to do crazy things like use an IP address as as your common name.
Gotcha. Good. Okay, so here's a pretty open-ended question that sadly I don't think we have a good answer for, but does Avaya have a list of all of the demo certs? And I assume what that means is a list of where all of the demo certs are being used. And I would assume that's a pretty huge list. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I don't know that there's really a good list that would show that. Probably the most critical components you could find in System Manager, but I don't know that I'm sure that wouldn't give you everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the answers that I gave, it's not an answer, but it's part of the process of doing that inventory, right? And the first one is knowing where would I ever go to a website? That's one right there, right? Because if it's almost always going to use HTTPS over HTTP, and then it's almost a matter of going product by product. And by the way, this is an important takeaway is this stuff, this concept it exists everywhere, not just in the Avaya world, right? So I think as soon as you start looking at your NICE recording and your various adjuncts, your polycoms that you might have, they all deal in this world of certificates. So you don't get to just say, oh, this is an Avaya topic. It's your enterprise, right?
Well, but I think what happened with the demo certs is that they were used, so basically it was the same CA and private key that were reused across multiple installations, multiple customers, right, even.
Yeah.
So I think that was really the issue with the demo certs, and that's part of the reason they were taken out of later releases of Aura to prevent further propagation of that problem. So it is a concern, but as far as which products have them installed as their CA and private, or their CA and private key, I don't know that Avaya publishes a list of those beyond what you might find in like PSNs, the product service notifications, maybe a PCN, product correction notice too. So you could search around on the support site for that.
Well, and one of the things that you can do within, you mentioned the ones that are touching Session Manager, right? Managed via System Manager. If you go into Session Manager, you can look at at the dashboard. You can look at some of the active connections or that are being made between Session Manager and other devices, such as a telephone, such as voicemail such as Communication Manager, and it will show you the private key length. It'll show you the cipher of the certificate authority. It'll show you all of those things and tell you, what's being used, and they give you a nice little dashboard with a bunch of, sadly, a lot of people are going to have red X's there saying that it doesn't meet current NIST standards. But the goal is you can use that as a good checklist, a good starting point to start knocking those out one by one and getting those to be green.
Yeah, it'll definitely cover the most critical components of an Avaya solution, right?
Yeah. Another question: can System Manager be the certificate authority for IP phones when we're looking at the SLA-MON, or now known as the Advanced Diagnostic Server? And I think that's, and I think you have, well, I know you have more experience with ADS than I do, but I don't think it's a matter of putting like individual identity certificates on the devices like the IP phones. I think it's more just a matter of making sure that they have the correct trust cert installed so that they trust SLA-MON.
That's right.
Is that accurate? Okay.
That's exactly right. So the phone has to trust SLA-MON, whatever certificate and CA is there. So yes, the answer is yes, you can create a private key and sign a certificate request for SLA-MON with System Manager. And assuming that that's the same CA your session manager is using and all your IP phones have access to, then you get automatic trust for SLA-MON, yeah.
So that one trust root certificate is covering you for all of those connections, not just the existing session manager.
Yeah. Now you need to make sure you're on the latest release of SLA-MON for that to work, ADS, because there was a release about 2 years ago, and I don't remember the release number exactly, unfortunately, but there was a release of SLA-MON that did not properly propagate the entire certificate chain. So if your phone didn't trust the intermediate certificate authority, even though it may have trusted the root, it would, since it wasn't being presented with the whole chain, it wouldn't trust SLA-MON. So that has since been fixed, but just so people are aware of that.
Yeah, we've actually seen that in weird scenarios with iPhones versus Android devices as to whether or not it needs the entire trust chain or not. So it's, you kind of just have to take a look at that. But I think to your point, sometimes a Google search or a search of PCNs, PSNs related to that product will uncover those things. Throw a security certificate in behind almost any product name, and you're gonna find some good documentation. So another question is there. Actually, I think this is a very similar question. Is there a list of server applications that show which Avaya servers have security certs? And I think we'll go back to maybe it's a combination of using the demo certs, or maybe it's not. Maybe in security certs in general. I think, and you've kind of been helping us craft a new offer for our maintenance and monitoring, our RMM solutions, where we could help determine which devices a customer have and what certificates are installed and what the expiration on those are, and to basically generate alarms that can do that. And I know some Avaya products do a pretty good job of saying, hey, I've got a certificate and it's expiring in 30 days, generate either a major or a minor alarm. I know Avaya or conferencing will do that. The big question for most people, are you paying attention to those alarms?
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And then if you have multiple instances of these things, it makes it even more difficult. So because what happens is you see the alarm a month before you have to renew the certificate, right? And then it doesn't, you forget about it.
Yeah, you're like, I've got 30 days, I'm fine.
Exactly. And then the day that it expires, nothing works, and you're like, oh, okay, I need to fix that. So yeah, it's really nice to have everything in a central place, and I think, as you mentioned, that offer that we're building around the monitoring tools will really help customers with that.
Perfect. So another question is, it seems like Avaya doesn't have the customer, or doesn't provide the customer with root access to the Avaya virtual machine appliances they install in the customer's VMware environments via Avaya OVA. So how do we provide our company's IT department with root access so that they can manage the certs on those virtual machines? Do you have thoughts related to that? Because do you need root access to manage the certs on some of these devices?
Not always. In fact, I think in most cases, Avaya has done a pretty good job of either giving the customer level login access to the key tool that's used to generate private keys and install the certificates and all that good stuff. There might be some cases where you have to use sudo or some other command to get you root level permission specifically for that task. But I think in most cases you can do that. Avaya does have offers where if a customer needs special root access, they can get that as well. So I don't know if there's a specific Avaya product, but I can't think of one off the top of my head that would require that.
Okay, I think that's like I said. I think there are ways, and I don't know if you have to pay for that. I think it's really a matter of signing a waiver, right? That says, hey, we're giving you the keys to the kingdom. If you screw it up, don't blame us.
Yeah.
Because you got to be careful what you have when you're given root access for some of those. You can shut down entire systems and applications pretty quick with incorrect commands. But I think in my experience at least, either Avaya has exposed access to doing that in maybe GUI format, either like enrolling, or I think of Avaya or conferencing in the element manager, right? You can manage all of your certificates there, so you don't even have to be in command line to do it. But I think for this person, they're saying, well, if I want to just give my IT department access so that they just do it for me, and they might want to use the standard Linux tools to manage that, what kind of access would they need? So I think you'd have to find out, in what scenarios are you running into problems, and then basically open a ticket with Avaya to determine what you would need to do to get the correct permissions. Do you have a list of gear that would be ideal for internal only versus external certs? So, enterprise versus public.
Yeah.
Do you have a thought process as to which ones you should put into internal enterprise and which ones you should do public?
Yeah, I mean, in general, the best practice is a pretty easy rule of thumb to follow, right? And that is, if anyone who would not automatically trust your certificate authority is going to be connecting to that service, then it needs to have a public CA. And the way to determine that is, well, could it be a BYOD device, you're like a mobile phone that a partner or one of your customers has. They're going to be in your building, and will they need access to this service? Or are they coming in from the internet, and will they need access to this service, right? So typically those are the two scenarios that would be a driver for a publicly signed certificate. Other than that, you own the devices that are going to be or the other components that will be connecting to this service, and you can push certificates as well as your trusted internal CA to those devices. So you don't really need a publicly signed CA on that interface. But that's kind of the rule of thumb. So,
and I think my thought process has kind of been aligned with that of where it's an internal audience only, use your enterprise certificate authority, and anything that's public or needs public access to that. But I'm hearing more and more stories of customers either in specific verticals, like that are very high security, very whether it's finance, whether it's government related.
Forcing you to install their certificate or their CA as a trusted CA?
Well, I guess we're seeing more and more of them asking for public certs, well-known certs on every device, even internal.
Oh, hmm.
So kind of the opposite. Are you seeing more of that, or no? Is
No,
that still pretty
no.
rare?
Yeah, I would say that's pretty rare. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
there are some customers who have large enterprise agreements with public CAs, and it could be that those customers have decided to go with a public CA for everything, right? Because they have an agreement with one of those companies, and it's easy for them to do that. And typically the reason or the driver behind those types of agreements is the fact that they want a third party to manage all of their CA.
so it's
Or,
more of a managed service on the
yeah,
certificates themselves
yeah,
more than anything. Gotcha. I think that's good. And I would imagine, and I think this explains some things that I've heard, some of these customers, they say, oh, they get their public certificates for so cheap.
yeah,
And that's probably because of like you said, they're paying for it. They're just paying for it
right,
as a managed service, not so much per certificate.
yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Thank you. Um, let's see, where are we? So, what kind of impact do you think this whole transition from SHA-1 to SHA-2 has on, for example, the CS1000? I mean, generically we can say CS1000 absolutely can do TLS. We see it in a number of areas. Is it a similar issue, a similar thing that we want to pay attention to, or are they immune to all this?
Well, Avaya has it on their roadmap for every product that they sell to support. I should say every product that they're currently selling, right, to support uh, SHA-2. When that happens for every product, I don't know, but they've definitely been moving in that direction just because of the issues surrounding SHA-1 and the ease, for people to hack it, basically. So yeah, that's something. I mean, like with the CS1K, I don't know what release supports SHA-2 versus SHA-1, but it's something that Avaya has on their roadmap for every product.
Okay. Uh, Maybe a similar question is, are we going to talk about, the AS5300? And my short answer is no, we weren't going to talk about the AS5300. But again, I think it's a similar kind of a concept, right? If you're using encryption, that is TLS based, you are going to deal with the idea of certificates. Now, and whether that's automated or not, or manual or whatever, that might be a different topic that certainly, I guess, is out of the scope of what our intended topic was. But do you know of anything different related to the 5300?
No, I don't.
Okay.
But it's pretty easy to find that information when you look at the specifications. Even an overview document, typically for an Avaya product, it'll have the supported SSL TLS certificates.
Okay. And I've noticed, when I want to look, specifically at a product, again, I tend to go to Google first, and I'll put the name of the product and put security certificates, and I find a ton of documentation, whether it's application notes, whether it's Avaya mentor videos on YouTube, which I know you were a big part of back in your previous life. Creating some of those. For those of you that don't know, Russell used to work for Avaya and in the serviceability team, as well as a number of other areas. Again, before he came to Arrow, we're thrilled to have him on board with our team. But he did exactly some of those kinds of trainings videos. And even authored some of those documents. But I find Google to be a fantastic aid, just knowing what to search for. And put product name, put security certificates, and you're going to find some good stuff. Another question, can you lock yourself out of the system while updating HTTPS? So I think we're talking about the web browser access, that kind of stuff. And if so, would it be a good practice to enable HTTP as a precaution?
Yeah, typically you're not going to lock yourself out of the system in the sense that that you couldn't get a client to connect to it, right? But you can break a service if you don't properly install a TLS certificate. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're saying it's not so much, is it maybe like how we do it today
It's
where,
more like the service won't start, right? I mean, HTTP or Apache, whatever the web server is, it just won't start if there's not a valid certificate and a valid chain. And the same with SSH and a lot of the other interfaces that we deal with.
so in those environments do, you know, I mean, let's say you do. Let's say you install an invalid certificate and you the service doesn't start the way it needs to. And what do? You work your way in command line? I would imagine you'd run into the
Yeah.
same issue
Yeah.
once you go SSH, right? Or no?
No, typically they're separate certificates. But even if they were the same, this is a great time to mention the need to virtualize and get on VMware, right? Because then you can just probably connect the console and do it there if you have to. So
Oh yeah,
a lot of
yeah.
options. Yeah.
And depending on the application, maybe make sure to do a snapshot before you
Yeah,
start
exactly.
breaking things, right? And be able to
Yeah,
revert back to a snapshot along those same lines, right, of doing things in
yeah,
VMware. Yeah, I will admit I'm a huge fan of deploying everything that I possibly can in VMware for those exact reasons.
yeah.
Life
You
becomes really
know,
easy.
and actually, Dave, the one thing I would recommend to that on that note, right, is whenever you're making a change to certificates, make sure you back up the old certificate as well as the old private key. That's one thing we see a lot of is, people will create a private key for a service, let's say it's HTTPS, right? They create a private key and then they generate their certificate signing request and then they go and request their certificate and they figure out it doesn't work and they delete the private key, the CSR, um, and the certificate, right? So when you do that, you have to start all over, and in some cases, what that means is your signing authority will charge you for another certificate. So it's a really good idea to back up your private key before you start really making any changes, because if you need to restore that for some reason, the certificate will require the private key as well.
Gotcha. And I would imagine everybody listening would be like, great, how do I do that? And the good news is, I
Totally.
think, yeah, but I think the good news is a lot of, this is the nice thing about Avaya adopting Linux in the vast majority of their applications. And a lot of the tools that we are talking about are very standard kinds of things, right? So, again, a Google search of, Linux backup SSH or backup TLS private keys, I think it will find you a whole bunch of good data. But I also would, I guess my generic answer is, yeah, if you're asking that question, it might be something you should be working with a partner to assist you on.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Next, will Avaya provide us with the necessary information and procedures for deploying certificates on their platforms? And I think in my experience, again, I think most of the documentation, whether it's the administration documents, the implementation documentation, does a pretty good job of doing that. But again, I get a little nervous if you're looking for very, very step-by-step, that this may be a task that is beyond what you may want to be doing yourself. And work with a partner, find, have them demonstrate it for you. Again, this is where you see a lot of people doing managed services, and letting a service provider do that task for them. Would you agree, disagree? Is that a little too cautious? Do you think these are tasks that people can take on, and especially where it is, maybe there are some products that are documented step by step?
Yeah, I think in general you'll find pretty good documentation on product and how to deploy certificates for that product. But certificates are they're very important to deploy at a solution level. It's important to deploy them across your solution, right? And the reason for that is because all of these things talk to each other, right? All of these different services and applications talk to each other. So it's important that they can continue to do that after you go deploy a new certificate to your session manager or system manager, right? And I think that's where it's probably more beneficial to engage a partner. Now, if you're just renewing a certificate, you could probably do that on your own. But to go and deploy a new certificate or a new signing authority or something like that is probably where you want to get a partner involved.
Perfect. So there's another question about documentation, and again, kind of our same response that we've had on the last couple of these is, look for Avaya's administration guides, maintaining type documentation, implementation guides. Google in general, I think, is a fantastic way to find more of the stuff, and even YouTube. There's more and more videos on these kinds of topics. Another one, we're getting right to the end here. One of the questions is on certificate formats, and I think I incorrectly, or whether it's incorrectly or not, I don't know, but it's maybe a little misleading. I made a statement of there being formats like a PEM formatted certificate versus a PKCS formatted certificate. And I think their statement here as well, PKCS 12 is actually a container, and I guess I was thinking of it more as just the kind of the formatting of that document. I guess I wasn't intending to get into the details specifically, but maybe could you give us a little high level of maybe the difference between the formats and the containers and what might be in what, or again, we can go high level on it. We don't need the super detail, but what do you think is important to know related to PEM, DIR, PKCS 12, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on what your software will support, your application will support, and unfortunately Avaya is not very consistent in this regard. I mean, some applications support PEM only, others support DIR, and it's just a way to encode the certificate basically. So you have one that's ASCII based and the other one is binary, right? That's basically the difference. The PKCS 12, PFX, P12 is the other one you'll see. Those are like containers that contain a private key and a certificate and sometimes the chain as well, the certificate chain. So you have to be kind of careful because if you take a PKCS 12 file, right, which could be DIR or PEM formatted, and try and load that into something that doesn't support that container format, then you'll have issues. And kind of the weird thing about it is, like, we've dealt with load balancers, for example, just as an example, right, that only support PKCS 12 in PEM format. So it's basically the private key, the certificate chain, and the certificate, the signed certificate, all in one package, right? And you have to use that to install a certificate on a load balancer. So it's honestly it requires a lot of research and documentation whenever you go to deploy a new certificate, just depending on the product or the solution. And that's why I mentioned too, it would be great to have a partner who has experience and expertise in that field to help you with that, like Arrow.
Perfect. Our last question is, and again, was really more agenda related of, will DoD signed certificates be discussed? And I personally am not too familiar with the specifics of DoD and the signing of certs, but so I did where do I go? I go to Google, and everything that I could tell from a DoD signed certificate is it's standard X509 certs. It's basically where the DoD has become it's not a well-known commercial cert like a GoDaddy or a Hawthorne or Thought or whatever. It is an enterprise cert. It just happens to be from a provider of a really, really big certificate authority. Just like you said earlier in the session, where they'll even kind of document their root certificate authority and all of the intermediaries, and I don't think the root ever actually does any signing. They just kind of authorize the intermediate signing or certificate authorities. But I think the format still very much stays the same. The documentation that I've seen also kind of poo-poos the SHA-1 or the the 1024-bit ciphers and things, kind of leaning more towards the SHA-2 or the 2048. And I know there's even bigger than that, right? I think we can go as high as 4096, and I don't know which, kind of things Avaya supports, but I didn't specifically see anything from the DoD that in their best practices mandate that big of a key. But again, I'm not an expert on that, and I didn't sleep in a Holiday Inn last night, so I can't say that I'm well versed in that completely. But to me, it sounds like DoD signed certificates are exactly like your signed certificates. It's an enterprise certificate authority. Would you agree?
Yeah, it seems that way, Dave. And I think it could be too that these are just customers or even partners who deal a lot with the government, and they need to be able to trust those certificates, or maybe the government requires that they sign their own certificates with that CA, right? So there shouldn't be an issue with that. As you said, there doesn't seem to be anything different as far as the format or the certificate itself, and even the chain that would prevent you from doing that with anything that supports standard TLS SSL certificates.
Perfect. Well, Russell, that is those are our questions. I thank you for one. It kind of saved me from having to manually type them all out, and I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And it's always good to get some color commentary on these different topics.
Oh yeah, and it's important to remember too, all of this is changing, right? I mean, there are new standards in the works even right now for certificates, so we have to remember that everything we talked about today could be a little bit different tomorrow or next month or next year.
So you're saying TLS 1.2 isn't the end?
Pretty sure.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Those hackers just keep getting better and better. That is for sure. Yeah. No. So again, thank you very much for joining us on our Q&A session on security certificates. I want to thank everybody who joined us on the original webinar earlier. The way you probably received this portion of it is when our marketing team sent out the notice for the replay information, and I certainly encourage you to go back, take a listen, forward it to your friends, all of that kind of good stuff. But Russell, again, thank you. Thank you guys for listening in, and we will talk to you next time.